Thank you, Stephen. Chairman Patch, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked to give an overview of bus operations in New Zealand. Some of what I was going to say has already been said yesterday, and probably more eloquently than I would have said it. So an overview of the overview, I'll provide you a little bit of background, explain the public transport operating model, which is a new method of planning and procuring bus services in New Zealand, the planning environment, how public transport is funded, the size of the markets, a little bit about the procurement, and a progress report on where we're at in Auckland. To provide a comparative sense of the three jurisdictions, New Zealand's a long, skinny country at the end of the earth, slightly bigger than the United Kingdom, but with 60 million people less. To illustrate it a bit more geographically, you could plonk New Zealand in the middle of Australia and no one would notice. And somewhere between Germany and Ireland, you'll see Singapore as a tiny little dot in the top corner there. I think that's illustrative for two reasons. One is public transport is about population density, and it's also about moving volumes of people. And the way you do it and the tools you have available have a lot to do with scale. So a little bit of recent history. In 2009, New Zealand changed governments to a national government. And when they were elected, they looked at public transport expenditure, and what they saw was that it had grown significantly. Their investment in public transport had grown significantly faster than patronage. And the way the minister of the time expressed it was that subsidies are growing far faster than patronage. Something's wrong with the system, we need to change it. It was really the opposite of what they expected. Increasing investment in public transport, they expected the per passenger subsidy to go down. So as a result of that, a collaborative process was engaged between government, local government, and the operators to develop a new way of looking at public transport, looking at what was wrong with the current system and how a better approach could be developed. And over about a 2-year period, the public transport operating model was developed, and it's known in New Zealand as just PTOM. And it's really a planning, procurement and business development framework which has an emphasis on operators and regional councils partnering to plan and deliver public transport. And it's supposed to be achieved through mechanisms such as collaborative business planning, joint investments and financial incentives to get the right sort of outcomes. And it really is an attempt to recognise that both parties bring something unique to the table, and by working together collaboratively, you get a better result. It's been implemented in New Zealand through a series of some legislative changes and operational changes. And the goal of it is to grow patronage with less reliance on subsidy. And it had two overarching objectives: to grow the commerciality of public transport services and to create incentives for services to become fully commercial, and also to grow confidence that services were priced efficiently and there was access to public transport markets for competitors. Because really in the previous 6 or 7 years, there had been little in the way of tendering, and there wasn't a lot of confidence that there was enough competition to get good pricing. So how is public transport planned in New Zealand now? Well, you have two levels of government, two tiers of government: central government and local government. Local government is made up of regional councils who have a responsibility for public transport, and territorial authorities who have roles similar to shires in Australia and are responsible for things like basic infrastructure, rubbish collection, water, sewerage. But in addition to that, responsibility for the roads, bus stops and bus shelters. So it requires regional councils and territorial authorities to work together. In six areas, the councils have responsibility for both, the unitary authorities. Auckland Council is one of them. So the government's role is carried out by the New Zealand Transport Agency, and they provide guidance for councils in planning their networks and developing public transport. So it's really an overview from a national perspective. They approve procurement procedures for public transport services. They also are a co-investor with local government through the National Land Transport Fund, and they monitor public transport performance. And the regional councils develop a regional public transport plan, which is their key planning document in the delivery of public transport, identifying the services that will be provided and the policies, procedures and information and infrastructure to support the delivery of those services. They also develop procurement procedures for public transport services, and they plan, procure, fund and monitor the delivery of those services. So how is it all funded? Well, fares contribute about 50% of the cost, and regional councils and the Transport Agency share the balance on about a 50-50 basis. Regional councils are funded by rates, which are a form of land tax, and the Transport Agency's share comes from the National Land Transport Fund, which is a hypothecated fund from fuel excise duty, road user charges and motor registration fees. So all of that money has to be spent on transport. And the planning and funding is on a 3-year cycle, and over the next 3 years the Transport Agency will be investing $2 billion in public transport in New Zealand. And that's about a 21% increase over the last 3-year period. Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch are the only really reasonable sized markets in New Zealand for public transport, and they make up 90% of that expenditure. So to give you a sense of the scale of public transport in New Zealand, so 1,160 buses and public transport in Auckland. Wellington's the next biggest, about 515. Christchurch sits at about 240, and the rest are really rats and mice. So with the public transport operating model, we're at the early stages of implementation 6 years later. It's a mixture of tendering and direct negotiation with incumbent operators. Some of the smaller regions have already tendered, with the incumbents regaining contracts. And negotiated contracts are benchmarked using the tendered prices in those markets. So a little bit about Auckland. The total market's been divided up into 50 units, and the 50 units are supposed to be big enough to be a viable business, standalone business, and there'll be a series of routes or a large route. About half of these are going to be, or have been, directly negotiated with operators. Some of them are on a like-for-like basis, recognising the existing business investments they've made over a number of years and obligations the government had, or ownership rights they had over those routes under the previous legislation. And those like-for-like contracts are for 12 years. Other negotiated contracts are for 6 years, and the tendered contracts are for 9. So in these new contracts, there's a strong emphasis on managing and improving performance, strong emphasis on KPIs with bonuses and abatements, performance indicators with cure plans where they're not being met, and defaults which have an impact on renewal rights and potentially cancellation rights, and financial mechanisms which are supposed to drive patronage. And those are the key performance indicators. And that's a graph of public transport patronage over the last 5 years in Auckland. So total trips over a year is 80 million. The green line, or the green area, is bus. The blue is train, and the lighter blue, ferries. There's been significant investment in new rolling stock, electrification, and rail infrastructure over the last 5 years, and that's seen a significant increase in rail patronage. That's likely to continue, but even with the most ambitious rail targets being met, bus will still continue to be around 80% of market share in Auckland. And it's just a graph of Auckland's public transport bus growth. So where are we now? The first set of 8 units have been tendered in Auckland. There's a real strong emphasis on probity. We've got no idea how many tenders were entered. There's a very tight time frame being worked to, and we understand it's running to time. And we'd expect in the next 2 to 3 weeks to hear who the successful tenderers are. What will come out of that? We'll have to wait and see. But there's been a strong interest from both the incumbents, but also operators from within Auckland and from outside in the tendering process. My best guess is there's somewhere between 6 and 8 tenderers for each of those 8 units. And we'll need to wait and see what happens. So in terms of the payment for the contracts used to be on a mix of net and gross contracts. In Auckland, all of them will be gross contracts, with fair revenue being kept by the regional council. The level of incentives through the financial incentive mechanism, the operator's view on it in Auckland at least is that it's probably not enough to provide an incentive for them to do anything differently, and is unlikely to drive patronage growth. The emphasis through the contract process has put a strong emphasis on management of the operators, and the concepts of partnership and partnering and working together collaboratively seem to have been, I won't say lost, because there's still partnering mechanisms there. But I think what operators are seeing through this process is somewhat less than they might have expected. So while it was an ambitious plan and some good ideas around working more collaboratively, the reality is much closer to a provider-procurer arrangement, with probably a great opportunity being lost. So I think that's about all I have on Auckland. So other regions in New Zealand, Wellington's probably about 6 months behind Auckland. Would expect to go to tender for around, and I was going to say around half of the market. That would be the operator's view on what should be negotiated versus tendered. The regional council there has a slightly different view. Their view is that in order to get sufficient information from tendering to benchmark, they would need to tender a bigger portion of the market. So that conversation is still continuing. And Canterbury, given the current state of Christchurch and its horizontal infrastructure, tendering there is probably still several years away. And the most likely outcome there is extension of existing contracts with the incumbents until such a time as Canterbury is sufficiently rebuilt to be able to have a good understanding of where routes should be planned and where people will be moving. Thank you.